Chapter 1. Whispers in the Walls. The old house stood at the edge of the property like a relic frozen in time. It had been built in the early 1800s, a grand Victorian home with tall windows, intricate woodwork, and a wraparound porch that overlooked the vast, untamed landscape. The moment Vanessa Sterling stepped onto the creaky wooden floorboards, she felt it, the weight of history pressing down on her. It was exactly the kind of place she had always dreamed of. After years of living in cramped apartments, she had finally taken a leap and bought her first home. The decision wasn't entirely practical. At 27, she was still paying off student loans and barely scraping by as a freelance editor. But something about this house had called to her. Maybe it was the way the light hit the stained glass windows in the late afternoon, or the scent of aged wood and forgotten memories that lingered in the air. Or maybe it was something deeper. She had gotten the house for an unbelievable price, probably because the real estate agent had been all too eager to close the deal. There had been whispers in the small town about the property. Rumors. Stories. Vanessa didn't believe in ghosts. Not until the first night. She had spent the entire day unpacking, filling the empty shelves with books, stacking dishes in the cabinets, and carefully arranging the furniture she had inherited from her grandmother. By the time the sun set, exhaustion had settled deep in her bones. She curled up on the worn-out couch, wrapped in a thick blanket, a cup of tea resting on the side table. The fire crackled in the old stone fireplace, casting flickering shadows across the walls. And then, the whisper. It was so faint she almost missed it. A breath of sound, like a voice carried on the wind. She sat up, her body tensing. The house settled around her, creaking as old houses do, but something felt off. The air had shifted, growing colder, heavier. The fire dimmed slightly, the flames shrinking as if something unseen had drawn the warmth from the room. Vanessa swallowed. Hello? The word barely left her lips before she saw him. A man stood at the edge of the room, near the fireplace. Her breath caught in her throat. He wasn't just any man. He was tall, with broad shoulders and an air of quiet authority. His dark hair was slightly tousled, his sharp cheekbones catching the low light. He was dressed in clothing that looked as though it belonged in a museum, black trousers, a crisp white shirt, a tailored waistcoat, and a silver pocket watch that gleamed at his side. But what struck her most were his eyes. Piercing blue. Intense. Haunted. You can see me, he murmured, almost disbelieving. Vanessa's heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Her mind scrambled for an explanation, a hallucination, exhaustion, a trick of the light, but none of it made sense. He was there. And yet, he wasn't. His figure shimmered at the edges, as if he existed between two worlds, caught in the flickering glow of the fire. Vanessa gripped the edge of the blanket, her knuckles turning white. Who are you? The man took a slow step forward, his gaze never leaving hers. My name is Justin Langford. His voice was deep, smooth, but laced with something ancient, something weighted with time. Vanessa exhaled shakily. You are a ghost. Justin tilted his head slightly. I suppose that is what you would call me. She swallowed. How is this possible? I don't know, he admitted. I've been here for years, bound to this house, but until now, no one has ever seen me. Vanessa's pulse pounded in her ears. She should have been afraid. She should have run. But something about him, about the sadness in his eyes, the way he looked at her as if she were the only thing anchoring him to the present, kept her rooted in place. Justin exhaled and glanced around the room. This house, it's changed. She blinked, her mind struggling to keep up. Well, yeah. It's been over 100 years. His gaze snapped back to her. What year is it? She frowned. 2009. His lips parted slightly, as if she had struck him with a physical blow. He took a half step back, his form wavering. God, he whispered. I thought it had only been a few years. Vanessa's chest tightened. Justin, when did you die? He hesitated. And then, quietly he said, 1865. A shiver ran down her spine. He had been here for nearly a century and a half. A long silence stretched between them, the fire crackling in the background. Justin looked at her again, his expression unreadable. "You are the first person to truly see me in all that time." Vanessa swallowed hard, her thoughts spinning. "Why?" "I don't know," he murmured. "But I intend to find out." And despite the impossibility of it all, despite the fact that she was standing in her living room talking to a man who had died over 100 years ago, Vanessa knew one thing. This was only the beginning. Chapter 2. A Man Out of Time. The air in the room was thick with something Vanessa couldn't quite define, something that lingered between fear and fascination. She had always considered herself a practical person, someone who believed in science, logic, and explanations. But standing here, staring at a man who had died over a century ago, she realized none of that mattered anymore. Because he was real. Justin Langford stood before her, watching her with an expression that mirrored her own disbelief. His translucent form flickered slightly in the firelight, like a candle's flame struggling against an unseen wind. And yet, despite the ghostly shimmer at the edges of his being, he looked so solid. Vanessa swallowed past the lump in her throat. "So, let me get this straight. You lived here. You died in 1865. And now you're just stuck?" Justin's expression darkened. "It would seem so." She stared at him, trying to wrap her head around what he was saying. "But why?" His gaze shifted toward the fire, his jaw tightening. "I wish I knew." A silence stretched between them, heavy and uncertain. Vanessa glanced down at her hands, still gripping the blanket she had been wrapped in. When she looked back up, Justin was studying her, really studying her, as if she were some kind of puzzle he was trying to solve. His stare sent a shiver down her spine. "What?" she asked. Justin shook his head slightly. "You're different." Vanessa raised an eyebrow. "Well, I'd hope so. I mean, I'm from the 21st century, and you're from..." She stopped, her words catching in her throat. She almost said from the past. But that didn't feel right. He wasn't just from the past. He was outside of time, trapped in a space between worlds. "I don't mean that," he said quietly. "I mean that I've been here for years, and I've never been able to communicate with anyone. They pass through this house, living their lives, never knowing I exist." Vanessa hesitated. "Not even once?" He shook his head. "Some have felt me, I think. A cold draft, a whisper in the halls. But no one has ever truly seen me. Until you." Something in the way he said it sent a strange warmth through her. Vanessa crossed her arms. "So, what? You think there's a reason I can see you?" Justin tilted his head slightly, considering. "Perhaps." "Great," she muttered. "So now I'm part of some ghostly mystery." A slight smirk tugged at the corner of Justin's lips. "It would appear so." Vanessa stared at him, her mind still struggling to accept what was happening. This had to be a dream. A hallucination. Some bizarre side effect of stress. And yet, the longer she stood there, the more real he became. "What do you remember?" she asked finally. Justin exhaled slowly. "About my life?" She nodded. He took a step toward the window, looking out into the darkened yard. The reflection of the fire flickered in the glass, making his figure seem even more spectral. "My family was wealthy," he began. "Old money. My father was a businessman, stern, proud. My mother, the perfect lady of the house. I had one younger brother, Charles. He died in the war." Vanessa's heart ached at the quiet sadness in his voice. "The Civil War?" Justin nodded. "We were expected to serve. It was a duty, an obligation. Charles went first. He never returned." He hesitated. "I was meant to go as well. But before I could enlist, I died." Vanessa frowned. "You don't remember how?" Justin's jaw tightened. "No." A chill ran down her spine. "Nothing at all?" He shook his head. "I remember going to bed one night, and the next thing I knew, I was here." He gestured to himself. "Like this." Vanessa stared at him, her thoughts racing. Could a person's memory of death be erased? Or was there something else at play, something deliberate? "What about your fiancé?" she asked. Justin's expression darkened. "Diana." The way he said her name carried a weight Vanessa couldn't quite place. She was the perfect choice for a wife, he said. Well-mannered, beautiful, intelligent. Our families arranged it as was expected. And I did as I was told. Vanessa tilted her head. Did you love her? Justin hesitated. No, he admitted finally. I respected her. But love? No. A strange sense of relief settled in Vanessa's chest. She ignored it. She shifted on her feet, trying to focus on the bigger picture. So, let me get this straight. You were engaged. You died mysteriously. And then, instead of moving on, you were trapped here. Justin gave her a wry look. That about sums it up. Vanessa ran a hand through her hair. Okay, but why are you still here? What's keeping you from moving on? His blue eyes met hers. That, Miss Sterling, is the question I've been trying to answer for over a century. Vanessa's stomach twisted. This was insane. Impossible. And yet, somehow, she knew that whatever had happened to Justin, whatever had bound him to this house, it wasn't over. And for reasons she didn't yet understand, she was now part of it. Chapter 3. A Love That Shouldn't Be. Vanessa wasn't sure what unnerved her more, the fact that she had a full conversation with a ghost, or the way she found herself thinking about him long after their encounter ended. Justin Langford. His name lingered in her thoughts, like the melody of an old song she couldn't quite forget. She spent the next few days pretending life was normal, editing manuscripts for clients, drinking too much coffee, walking through town as if she didn't live in a house haunted by a man who had died in 1865. But no matter how hard she tried to ignore it, the house still felt different. Every time she walked into a room, she sensed him. Not in the typical ghostly way, no sudden chills or flickering lights, but something subtler. A presence. A feeling. She wasn't alone. And she wasn't scared. That was the strangest part. One evening, as she sat curled up on the couch, flipping absently through a book, the feeling intensified. It was almost like the air thickened, as though the house itself was holding its breath. She looked up. He was there. Standing by the window, his hands clasped behind his back, Justin gazed outside, lost in thought. The soft glow of the fire illuminated his sharp features, casting flickering shadows against his high cheekbones. He looked so real in that moment, so solid. She almost forgot what he was. He must have sensed her watching because he turned, his piercing blue eyes locking onto hers. "You're back," Vanessa said, voice quieter than she intended. A faint smirk ghosted across his lips. "Did you miss me?" She rolled her eyes. "I was starting to think I'd imagined you." Justin stepped toward her, his movements impossibly smooth, like a memory drifting through time. "And yet, here I am." Vanessa hesitated. "Why do you keep coming back?" His smirk faded. "Perhaps because you're the first person who has ever truly seen me." She swallowed. He was right. For over 100 years, he had existed in this house, unseen, unheard, forgotten, until her. "Does it hurt?" she asked suddenly. His brow furrowed. "What?" "Being like this." She gestured to him, his half there, half not form. "A ghost." Justin's expression shifted, something almost unreadable passing through his gaze. At first, it did, he admitted. The first few years were the hardest. The loneliness, the confusion. I didn't understand why I was still here. Vanessa's heart clenched. She could see it now, the pain behind his sharp exterior, the weight of over a century spent trapped between life and death. Justin glanced down at his hands, flexing his fingers as if testing his own existence. Over time, I stopped feeling much of anything. But now, his gaze lifted to hers. Now it's different. She felt her pulse quicken. "Why?" His eyes held hers, steady and unflinching. "Because of you." The air between them crackled, charged with something Vanessa couldn't name. She shifted in her seat, suddenly feeling too warm despite the cool autumn night. "That's a lot of pressure, you know." Justin's lips twitched. "I don't mean to burden you, Miss Sterling." She let out a small laugh, shaking her head. "Vanessa. You can just call me Vanessa." His expression softened. Vanessa. The way he said her name sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. She cleared her throat, trying to shake the strange pull between them. So, do you just haunt this house all day, or do you have hobbies? Justin chuckled, the sound low and warm. Unfortunately, the afterlife does not come with many forms of entertainment. Tragic. Indeed. Vanessa bit her lip, glancing at the book in her lap. An idea struck her. Have you ever read modern literature? She asked. Justin raised an eyebrow. Modern? She held up the novel. This is Pride and Prejudice. It's not exactly modern, but it's still after your time. Jane Austen. He tilted his head, intrigued. I've heard the name. Vanessa smirked. So, you're telling me you've been stuck in this house for over a century and never thought to read the books that have been left behind? Justin crossed his arms. I wasn't aware I had the option. Well, congratulations. She held out the book. You do now. Justin hesitated, then reached for it, only for his fingers to pass through the pages like mist. Vanessa's breath caught. Justin's jaw tensed, and he withdrew his hand. She didn't know why, but something about it made her heart ache. Without thinking, she scooted closer, holding the book open between them. I'll read to you. Justin blinked. You don't have to. I know. She glanced at him. But I want to. For a moment, he just stared at her, as if trying to figure her out. Then, slowly, he sat beside her. She turned to the first page, her voice filling the quiet room as she began to read. And Justin listened. For the first time in over 100 years, he wasn't alone. Chapter 4. The Choice Between Two Lifetimes. Days turned into weeks. Justin became a constant presence in Vanessa's life. She no longer questioned it, no longer wondered if she was losing her mind. He was real. She read to him every night. They talked for hours about everything, his life in the 1800s, her life in the modern world, the strange bridge that connected them despite the years between them. She learned that he had loved music, that he had once dreamed of traveling to Europe before his father had forced him into an engagement with Diana. He learned that she had spent most of her life trying to escape a past filled with heartbreak and loss. And somewhere in those late-night conversations, somewhere between the words and the silence, something changed. Vanessa felt it. The way his gaze lingered on her a little longer. The way his voice softened when he said her name. She was falling for him. A ghost. A man who had died before she was even born. It was impossible. And yet, when she looked into his blue eyes, she knew the truth. He felt it too. One night, as she sat by the fire, she finally asked the question that had been haunting her. Is there a way? She whispered. Justin turned to her, his expression unreadable. A way for what? For you to live again. The words hung in the air between them. Justin's jaw tightened. Yes. Vanessa's heart pounded. How? He hesitated. A spirit can be reborn, but at a cost. She swallowed. What cost? Justin exhaled. If I choose to be reincarnated, I will be born in your time. But I won't remember any of this. Vanessa's throat went dry. You'd forget me? His eyes met hers, filled with something deep and painful. Yes. Her breath hitched. And if you don't? She asked. Then I stay here. In my time. He hesitated. With Diana. Vanessa's chest tightened. Justin looked at her, his voice quieter now. If I stay, my memories of you will be erased. It will be as if we never met. Vanessa's pulse pounded in her ears. She had a choice. Let him go, let him live a new life and hope to pray that fate would bring them together again. Or let him stay, knowing he would never remember her. Her heart ached. What do you want? Justin took a step closer. I want you. And in that moment, Vanessa knew. This was love. Love beyond time. Love beyond life itself. But now, they had to decide. Would they risk everything for a second chance? Or would they let fate erase them from each other's lives? Chapter 4. A Leap of Faith. The fire in the hearth burned low, the golden embers casting a soft glow over the parlor. Outside, the autumn wind howled against the windows, shaking the old glass panes. Inside, however, the world felt still, silent save for the sound of Vanessa's breathing and the measured weight of Justin's gaze upon her. His words still hung in the air between them. "I want you." Vanessa swallowed hard, her pulse quickening. She had never felt anything like this before, this raw, impossible connection. A connection that shouldn't exist, and yet, it did. Her mind screamed at her to be rational. He was a ghost. A man who had died over a century ago. And yet, her heart whispered the truth. She loved him. She hadn't wanted to admit it, not to herself, not to him, but now, there was no denying it. And if she let him go, if he chose to be reborn, she might never find him again. He wouldn't remember her. The thought nearly broke her. Justin took a step toward her, his form flickering slightly in the dim firelight. He wasn't solid, he never had been, but right now, he felt realer than anything she had ever known. "There's no guarantee I'd find you again," he said quietly. Vanessa's throat tightened. "I know. I could be born anywhere to anyone. I might live a completely different life. I might," he hesitated, his gaze darkening. "I might never love you." The word sent a sharp pain through her chest. Justin's fingers twitched at his sides, as if he wanted to reach for her, but knew he never could. "If I stay, I lose you. If I go, I lose this." Vanessa looked up at him, searching his face, memorizing every detail, his sharp cheekbones, the way his dark hair fell slightly over his forehead, the storm of emotion in his piercing blue eyes. If he chose to stay, he would return to her, but he would belong to another. If he chose to leave, he would be reborn, and she would have to find him all over again. A shudder ran through her. "Justin, I don't want to lose you." His expression softened, and for the first time, his carefully restrained mask slipped. "I don't want to lose you either," he admitted. Vanessa took a shaky breath. "But if you stay, if you go back to 1865, you'll forget me. You'll marry Diana, live the life you were supposed to." Justin's jaw clenched. "A life I never wanted." Tears burned behind Vanessa's eyes. "Then don't go back. Don't let them take you from me." He exhaled sharply. "And if I go forward? If I'm reborn? Will you find me, Vanessa?" She didn't hesitate. "Yes." Justin looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing the truth of her words, measuring her resolve. Then he stepped even closer, so close she could almost feel him, despite the fact that his body had no substance. "I believe you," he murmured. Vanessa's breath hitched. Justin tilted his head slightly, his gaze softening. "If I leave, I need you to promise me something." She swallowed. "Anything?" Justin hesitated, then said, "If I don't remember you, don't give up on me." Vanessa's chest tightened. "I won't." His eyes held hers, full of quiet intensity. "No matter how long it takes?" She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "No matter how long it takes." A long silence stretched between them, filled with unsaid words, unspoken hopes. And then, finally, Justin smiled, a small, sad smile, but real nonetheless. "Then I choose you." The moment the words left his lips, the air in the room changed. A deep, sudden gust of wind rushed through the house, rattling the windows and extinguishing the fire. The very foundation of the home seemed to tremble beneath them. Justin took a sharp breath, his form flickering wildly now, as if something unseen was pulling him away. Vanessa's heart pounded. "Justin." He reached for her, out of instinct, out of desperation. And for the briefest moment, she felt something warm brush against her fingers. Then he was gone. Vanessa gasped, stumbling forward, but there was nothing there. The room was empty. Justin was gone. A cold silence filled the air, heavy and suffocating. She stood there for what felt like hours, her body trembling, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. Had she made the right choice? Had he? What if she never found him? What if he was born into a life that took him far from her, into a world where she would never cross his path? The thought sent a wave of panic crashing through her, but she forced herself to take a deep breath. No. She had promised him. She would find him, no matter how long it took. And so, with the fire nothing but cold ashes, and the house now truly empty for the first time, Vanessa whispered the words into the quiet darkness. "I'll find you, Justin." And then, she waited. Waited for fate to bring him back to her. Waited for the man she loved to return. Waited for a love beyond time. Chapter 5. The search begins. The house felt different without him. Vanessa had spent weeks growing used to Justin's presence, the way the air seemed to shift when he entered a room, the way she could feel his eyes on her even when she wasn't looking. Now, the silence felt unbearable. She had promised to find him. But how did one find a man who had been reborn with no memory of his past? Vanessa sat at her desk, staring at her laptop screen, fingers poised over the keyboard. She had no idea where to start. Justin Langford, born in 1991. That was all she had to go on. No last name, no location, no certainty that he even still had the same name at all. Still, she had to try. She typed in her first search. Justin Langford, born 1991, New York. A dozen results popped up, some social media profiles, a few birth records, nothing concrete. She narrowed the search. Nothing. Vanessa exhaled sharply, rubbing her temples. This wasn't going to be easy. She had known that. But she hadn't realized just how impossible it would feel. She closed the laptop with a sigh and leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. What if she never found him? What if fate had sent him somewhere she could never reach? A sharp pang of loneliness settled in her chest. The idea of moving forward without him, of never seeing those piercing blue eyes again, was almost too much to bear. She had lost people before. Her father. Relationships that never worked out. But this was different. Justin wasn't just someone she had loved. He was the one. She wasn't willing to accept that he was lost to her. Not yet. She needed a new approach. If Justin had been reborn in 1991, that meant he would be 18 years old in 2009. A teenager, likely in college or finishing high school. That narrowed things down. Vanessa pulled out a notebook and started listing major universities across New York. If he had grown up here, he might have stayed in the state. It was a long shot, but she had nothing else to go on. With renewed determination, she began searching through online yearbooks, scanning photos for any sign of him. Hours passed. Nothing. By the time the clock struck midnight, exhaustion pulled at her bones, but she refused to give up. She clicked on another set of images, her heart pounding as she scrolled through the photos. And then, she saw him. Her breath caught in her throat. It was a student ID photo from a local university. The name beneath it read, Justin Carter. Vanessa's heart pounded. The hair was different, shorter, styled differently, but the eyes were the same. Those same piercing blue eyes. Her hands trembled as she zoomed in, studying the image. Could it really be him? Was this the man she had fallen in love with? There was only one way to find out. Vanessa grabbed her jacket and keys. She was going to find him. Chapter 6. A stranger with familiar eyes. Vanessa's heart pounded as she drove through the dimly lit streets of Albany, the city's lights a blur outside her window. The student ID photo of Justin Carter burned in her mind. Could it really be him? Her logical side screamed at her that this was insane. That she was chasing a ghost, literally. But her heart knew better. She had promised him. She wasn't going to break that promise now. The address she had found listed Justin Carter as a student at Hudson University, a small private college nestled on the edge of town. She had no idea if he still lived on campus or if he had moved, but it was her only lead. She pulled into the parking lot outside one of the student dormitories and turned off the engine. For a long moment, she just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, trying to steady her breathing. What was she supposed to say to him? Hi, We were in love in another lifetime, but you don't remember me. Also, you used to be a ghost. Want to grab coffee? Yeah, that would go well. Vanessa groaned, rubbing her temples. But she had come this far. She wasn't leaving without seeing him. Taking a deep breath, she stepped out of the car and made her way toward the dormitory entrance. A security keypad was mounted beside the door, requiring a student ID to enter. She hovered near the entrance, waiting until a group of students approached. When one of them swiped their ID and held the door open for their friends, she slipped in behind them. No one questioned her. She moved quickly, heart racing, scanning the directory on the wall. Room 307, Justin Carter. She took the stairs 2 at a time, her pulse drumming in her ears. And then, suddenly, she was standing outside his door. This was it. Vanessa raised her hand, hesitating for only a second before knocking. Silence. She knocked again. Footsteps. Then, the door opened. And there he was. Her breath caught. He was real. Not a flickering ghost. Not a shadow from another time. A real man. Flesh and blood. He looked different. His dark hair was shorter than before, tousled in a way that suggested he had just run his fingers through it. He wore a simple t-shirt and jeans, and his posture was relaxed. But the eyes were the same. Those same piercing blue eyes that had once held centuries of sorrow, of longing, of love. And now they held something else. Confusion. Justin tilted his head, studying her. Do I know you? Vanessa's throat went dry. She had known this moment was coming, had prepared for it, but nothing could have truly braced her for the ache that spread through her at the realization. He didn't know her. She forced a small smile, masking the storm of emotions inside her. No, we've never met. Justin leaned against the doorframe, watching her warily. Okay, so, what's up? Vanessa scrambled for an excuse. Think. My name's Vanessa, she blurted. I'm writing an article about local students and their experiences at Hudson. Would you be willing to do a short interview? She nearly cringed at the lie. Justin frowned slightly. An article? Yeah, she said quickly. It's for an independent publication. Just a casual feature piece. He studied her for a moment, as if trying to gauge whether she was telling the truth. Then, to her surprise, he shrugged. Sure, why not? Vanessa released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Justin stepped back, gesturing for her to come inside. Her pulse quickened as she crossed the threshold. The room was simple, a standard dorm setup with a twin bed, a desk cluttered with books and papers, and a small bookshelf filled with classic literature. Her gaze lingered on the books. Pride and Prejudice. Her heart clenched. Justin closed the door behind her and leaned against the desk, crossing his arms. So, what do you want to ask me? Vanessa hesitated. How could she possibly condense everything she wanted to say? What if he never remembered her? What if she had already lost him? She swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay composed. Tell me about yourself, she said carefully. Who is Justin Carter? He chuckled, running a hand through his hair. That's a weird way to phrase it. Vanessa smiled slightly. Humor me. He exhaled, thinking. Well, I was born in 1991. Grew up in Albany. I'm a history major. I guess you could say I've always been interested in the past. Vanessa's heart pounded. Justin continued. I don't know why, but I've always felt this weird connection to old places. Like déjà vu, you know? She held her breath. Déjà vu. He nodded. Yeah. Sometimes I'll visit a historical site or read about an event, and I feel like I was there. Like I've lived it. Vanessa felt her pulse skyrocket. He didn't remember. But something inside him did. He leaned forward slightly. And then there are the dreams. Vanessa's breath caught. Justin glanced away, almost embarrassed. I know it sounds weird, but I've been having these dreams for years. Always the same thing. A house, a fireplace, and a woman's voice. Her fingers tightened around the edge of her notebook. What does she say? She asked softly. Justin hesitated. I don't know. I never see her face. But her voice, it feels like I should know it. Vanessa swallowed the lump in her throat. It was her. She was in his dreams. Fate had kept their connection alive, even if he didn't remember her. She wanted to tell him everything. Wanted to shake him, to make him remember. But she couldn't force it. She had to let it happen on its own. Justin's gaze flickered to her, curiosity sparking in his eyes. Why do I feel like I've met you before? Vanessa's chest tightened. She forced a small smile, heart hammering. Maybe, she said carefully, we knew each other in another life. Justin chuckled, shaking his head. That'd be crazy. Vanessa's smile faded slightly. Yeah, she murmured. Crazy. But as she looked into his eyes, she knew the truth. Fate had brought him back to her. Now, she just had to make him remember. Chapter 7. The Echoes of the Past. Vanessa could barely breathe. Justin was here alive, real, standing in front of her. And yet, it wasn't him. Not yet. The echoes of who he had been still lingered beneath the surface, his interest in history, his fascination with old places, the dreams that whispered remnants of their past together. But the soul-deep recognition that she longed for, the certainty that would tell her that Justin remembered her, wasn't there. Not yet. Vanessa had promised she would find him. Now, she had to make him remember. They agreed to meet for coffee the next day. Justin had seemed intrigued by their conversation, and Vanessa used the excuse of the interview to keep talking to him. She could tell he was drawn to her, though he didn't quite understand why. That was good. It meant something inside him still knew. They met at a quiet cafe near campus, a small, rustic shop with exposed brick walls and shelves filled with books. The moment Vanessa walked in, her gaze landed on him. He was sitting at a table near the window, flipping absently through a book, Pride and Prejudice. Her breath caught. It had been their book. She hadn't even known if he had ever truly heard the words when she had read them to him as a ghost, but something inside him must have held on to it. Justin looked up as she approached, flashing a small smile. Hey, he said, setting the book down. Vanessa slid into the seat across from him. Hey yourself. He studied her, as if trying to figure something out. You're different. She raised an eyebrow. Different how? Justin hesitated. I don't know. You feel familiar. Her heart pounded. That's not a bad thing, is it? No, he admitted. Just strange. Vanessa smiled softly, then nodded toward the book. You like Pride and Prejudice? He smirked. I wouldn't exactly call it my usual read, but something about it just felt right. He flipped the book open, tracing his fingers over the words. Like I've read it before, even though I know I haven't. Vanessa swallowed hard. Maybe you have. In another life. Justin exhaled a small laugh, shaking his head. You really believe in that kind of thing, huh? She met his gaze. I do. Justin leaned back in his chair, watching her. All right. Convince me. Vanessa hesitated. She couldn't just drop the truth on him, couldn't tell him, hey, you used to be a ghost, and we fell in love, and you made me promise to find you in this life. That would send him running. But she could guide him there. She folded her hands on the table. Have you ever had that feeling when you meet someone and you just know them, even though you've never met? Justin studied her. Like déjà vu? She nodded. More than that. Like a connection that doesn't make sense. His expression flickered with something unreadable. Vanessa leaned in slightly. What if some souls are meant to find each other? No matter where, no matter when. Justin's lips parted slightly, as if the words struck something deep inside him. He was silent for a long moment before he finally murmured, That's a nice thought. Vanessa swallowed past the lump in her throat. It's more than a thought, she said softly. It's real. The first memory. That night, Justin dreamt of firelight. Of soft laughter. of a woman's voice reading words he couldn't quite make out. He sat up in bed, heart pounding, his skin damp with sweat. The dream had felt so real, like a memory just out of reach. And in that moment, Vanessa's words from earlier echoed in his mind. What if some souls are meant to find each other? Justin ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. What the hell was happening to him? The next day, Vanessa took a risk. She invited Justin to her house, the place where it had all started. The moment he stepped inside, she saw it, the way his body tensed slightly, the way his eyes flickered toward the grand fireplace as if something inside him recognized it. She watched him carefully. Everything okay? She asked. Justin shook his head, frowning. This place, it feels familiar, she supplied. He exhaled. Yeah. Vanessa's heart pounded. It was working. She led him through the house, carefully watching his reactions. When they reached the library, he stopped abruptly. His fingers brushed the edge of the grand piano. I know this room, he murmured. Vanessa held her breath. How? Justin's brow furrowed. I don't know. He looked up at her, and for the first time, there was something in his expression, something like fear. Vanessa, what is this? She stepped toward him slowly. It's your past. Justin's breath caught. My what? Vanessa took another step closer, her voice soft but steady. You've been here before. You lived here before. Justin shook his head. That's impossible. She swallowed. No, it's not. You don't remember yet, but you will. Justin backed up slightly, rubbing the back of his neck. This is crazy. Vanessa hesitated. She had to be careful. Pushing too hard would scare him off. She reached for Pride and Prejudice from the bookshelf and held it out to him. Then tell me why you've dreamt of this, she said gently. Justin stared at the book, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he took it from her hands. The moment his fingers brushed the cover, he froze. A sharp inhale, a flicker of something in his gaze. And then a whisper, a memory. Vanessa's voice, reading to him by the fire. His head snapped up, eyes locking onto hers, his pupils blown wide. What was that? He whispered. Vanessa's breath hitched. A memory. Justin swallowed, his throat working. I don't understand. She stepped closer, heart pounding. You will. Justin shook his head, exhaling sharply. Vanessa, I think I've known you before. Vanessa's eyes burned with unshed tears. She nodded. You have. Justin let out a shaky breath. He didn't remember everything yet, but he was starting to. And that meant she still had time. Epilogue, a future written in the stars. The morning light streamed through the large bay windows, casting golden patterns across the hardwood floors. A soft breeze carried the scent of autumn through the open panes, rustling the curtains ever so slightly. Vanessa stood in the kitchen, pouring 2 cups of coffee. It had been 6 months since Justin had remembered. 6 months since her world had been rewritten. And yet, sometimes, it still didn't feel real. She had spent so long searching for him, aching for him, wondering if fate would ever truly bring him back to her. And now, he was here. Alive. Breathing. Laughing. Loving her. She turned, carrying the 2 mugs toward the living room, where Justin sat on the couch, his long legs stretched out, a book resting open in his hands. She smiled. I should have known you'd be reading. Justin glanced up at her with that familiar smirk, the same one he had worn when he had teased her back in another time, another life. You're the one who made me fall in love with books, remember? Vanessa handed him the coffee and settled onto the couch beside him, tucking her legs beneath her. I think you already love them. You just didn't have anyone to share them with. Justin studied her for a long moment before setting his coffee down on the table. He reached for her hand, his fingers warm and solid against her own. I didn't have you. Vanessa's heart clenched at the quiet sincerity in his voice. She squeezed his hand, running her thumb over the back of his knuckles. And now, his blue eyes softened. Now, I do. Vanessa let out a small breath, leaning her head against his shoulder. It still doesn't feel real sometimes. Justin exhaled a quiet laugh, pressing a kiss to her temple. I know. I wake up every morning half expecting to fade away again. Vanessa lifted her head to meet his gaze. You won't. His lips quirked. You sound awfully sure of that. I am. She smiled. You were meant to come back. We were meant to find each other again. Justin ran a hand through her hair, his fingers lingering as he traced slow, lazy patterns against her skin. Do you really believe that? Vanessa tilted her head, studying him. Don't you? He was quiet for a long moment. Then, finally, he nodded. I do. Because how else could he explain it? How else could he explain the way he had known her before he ever met her, the way his dreams had whispered her name long before she appeared in his life? How else could he explain the way his heart had recognized her before his mind had? He had been hers long before he had ever been born again. And he always would be. Justin pulled her closer, pressing his forehead against hers. We have a second chance. Vanessa smiled. We do. He brushed his nose against hers. What do we do with it? Vanessa's smile widened. Anything we want. And just like that, the past no longer mattered. The lost time, the aching years of separation, the impossible circumstances that had kept them apart, none of it mattered. Because they had found their way back to each other. And this time, nothing would take them away from each other again. Not time. Not fate. Not even death. Because some loves are eternal. And theirs was one of them. Forever. And always. The end.